18 months. That was all it took. 18 months after the last human ship crossed back into its own space, the first real crisis hit the galaxy like a hammer on glass. The Draenei Federation moved a full war fleet into the neutral corridor. The corridor was a thin strip of unclaimed space that separated Draenei territory from the Marathi sovereignty. It had been established 40 years ago through a treaty that a human negotiator had spent 3 years putting together. That negotiator had studied both species. She had learned the Draenei language, eaten their food, and understood that they viewed direct eye contact as a dominance challenge. She had learned that the Marathi, a reclusive species whose bodies were made of living crystal, interpreted raised voices as a declaration of violence. She had threaded the needle between two civilizations that despised each other, and somehow made them agree to share a border in peace. That treaty held for 40 years, because humans maintained it. They ran the monitoring stations. They staffed the neutral checkpoints. They were the faces that both sides saw when they looked across the divide, and both sides trusted them just enough to keep their weapons down. Now the stations were empty. The checkpoints were dark, and the Draenei saw an opening. The Concord Assembly called an emergency session. Delegates filled the great chamber. Voices overlapped. Accusations flew. The Marathi representative, a tall crystalline figure that refracted light in shifting patterns, demanded that the Concord intervene immediately. The Draenei representative growled that the corridor had always been rightfully Draenei territory, and that the treaty was made under human pressure that no longer applied. For the first time in living memory, there was no human delegation sitting calmly in the middle of the room, waiting for both sides to exhaust themselves before quietly offering a solution that neither side had considered. Risara saw her chance. The Velkari ambassador stood and offered her people as mediators. Her voice was smooth and confident. She spoke of the Velkari Dominion's ancient wisdom, their long history of leadership, their natural ability to see the larger picture. Several delegates nodded along. The mediation began 3 days later aboard a Velkari diplomatic vessel. It collapsed in two. Risara did not know that looking a Draenei commander in the eyes while speaking was considered a challenge. She did not know that the Marathi required long silences between statements to process information through their crystalline neural networks. She filled every pause with words. When the Draenei ambassador snarled at her, she snarled back, because that was how the Velkari handled disagreements. The Marathi representative shattered a section of the conference table with a resonance burst, which was the Marathi equivalent of screaming in terror. The Draenei walked out. The Marathi sealed their borders. Risara returned to the Axis and blamed both species for being unreasonable. Nobody pointed out that a human mediator would have known better. Nobody wanted to admit that. Far from the political chaos, on a small, battered space station floating in neutral territory, a young human man named Danny Calloway watched the news feeds and felt his stomach turn. He was a mechanic by trade, good with engines, better with people, and terrible at following instructions. When humanity withdrew, Danny was supposed to leave with everyone else. His sister Grace had sent him 17 messages telling him to come home. His parents had called. His former commanding officer had called. Danny had ignored all of them. He stayed because the station was his home. He had built half of it with his own hands. His friends were here. Lyreni traders, Orvani freighter crews, even a few Keth merchants who pretended not to like him, but always brought him engine parts as gifts. Danny could not imagine leaving them behind, so he did not. But the galaxy Danny loved was changing around him. His Tohari customers stopped coming first. Then the Orvani became nervous, making their trades quickly and leaving without the long conversations Danny enjoyed. The Lyreni still came, but they came scared, looking over their shoulders, speaking in whispers about Draenei patrols moving closer. One afternoon, Danny was repairing a coolant line in his docking bay when 3 Draenei soldiers walked in. They were tall, canine-featured, with heavy armor and heavier attitudes. They pushed past a Lyrani merchant who was loading supplies onto a small transport. The merchant stumbled and dropped a crate. The soldiers laughed. Danny put down his wrench and walked over. "Hey," he said. "You break it, you buy it. Station rules." The lead soldier looked down at him. Draenei were a full head taller than most humans. The soldier bared his teeth in what might have been a grin. "What are you gonna do, little human? Your fleet is gone. Your people ran away. You are nothing here." Danny held the soldier's gaze. He did not look away. He had grown up on cargo docks and construction yards, and he had never in his life backed down from someone bigger than him. It was a quality that his sister called stupid, and his friends called brave, and Danny figured the truth was probably somewhere in the middle. "I am the guy who runs this station," Danny said calmly. "And on this station you do not push people around. You want fuel and supplies? You behave. You want trouble? The airlock is that way." The soldiers stared at him for a long, tense moment. Then they laughed again, but they moved on. They bought their fuel and left without further incident. The Lyrani merchant thanked Danny with tears in her wide dark eyes. Danny shrugged and went back to his coolant line. That night, he called Grace. Her face appeared on the comm screen, tired and worried. She worked as an analyst for human border intelligence now, spending her days reading reports about the galaxy humanity had left behind. "Things are getting bad out here, Grace," Danny said. "I know," she replied. "I read the reports every day. The Concord is falling apart. Old alliances are breaking. Species that tolerated each other because we were always in the room are remembering why they hated each other. Then send help." Grace was quiet for a moment. "I cannot. You know I cannot. The withdrawal was a collective decision. Every colony voted for it. People are going to get hurt." "People are already getting hurt," Grace said softly. "Come home, Danny, please." Danny shook his head. "Someone has to stay." Grace closed her eyes. She looked like she wanted to argue, but she knew her brother. She knew that particular set of his jaw, that particular look in his eyes. It was the same look their father used to get before doing something brave and reckless. It was the look that said the decision was already made. "Be careful," she whispered. "Always," Danny lied. The border skirmish between the Draenei and the Marathi happened 1 week later. 3 Marathi patrol ships were destroyed in a sudden, brutal ambush. The Concord Assembly convened again. They debated. They argued. They issued a formal condemnation in the strongest possible language. Then, they did absolutely nothing. Counselor Ithara stood before the assembly one more time. Her skin was pale with grief, shifting through shades of gray that her species displayed only in their deepest sorrow. "We are failing," she said. Her voice was steady, but barely above a whisper, and the chamber was so quiet that every word carried. "We are failing in the most basic duty any alliance has, the duty to protect its members. We spent so long relying on humans to solve our problems that we never learned how to solve them ourselves. And now that they are gone, we stand here doing nothing while people die." The assembly listened. Some looked ashamed. Some looked angry. Most looked away. The vote came quickly. The matter was tabled for further discussion at a later date. The Draenei advanced 2 more systems into the neutral corridor before that later date ever came. 3 years after humanity left, the galaxy was no longer cracking. It was breaking apart. The border skirmish between the Draenei and the Marathi had grown into a full regional war. 2 more species had been pulled into the fighting. The Orvani, a tall and quiet people who valued trade above all else, were dragged in because their shipping lanes ran through the contested corridor, and the Draenei gave them a simple choice: join us or be treated as enemies. The Keth, a small but fierce species with deep historical ties to the Marathi, entered on the other side. 4 species were now killing each other over a strip of space that a single human diplomat had once kept peaceful, with patience and understanding. The Concord's peacekeeping fleet tried to respond. It was a disaster. The fleet had once been a formidable force, bolstered by human ships, human tactics, and human commanders who had a strange gift for creative thinking in the middle of chaos. Now it was led by a Velkari officer named Torvan, who had spent his entire career in parade formations and ceremonial exercises. Torvan was not a bad officer. He was disciplined and organized, but he thought in straight lines, and the Draenei did not fight in straight lines. Torvan sent his fleet into the corridor in a standard containment formation. The Draenei split their forces, flanked him from 2 directions, and destroyed a quarter of his ships before he could adjust. The peacekeeping fleet retreated in disorder. Torvan filed a report blaming faulty intelligence. Nobody believed him, but nobody replaced him either. While the corridor burned, something worse was happening on the other side of the galaxy. The Tohari collective was moving. The Tohari had always been strange. A hive-minded insectoid species, they thought as one, moved as one, and made decisions with a cold, mathematical efficiency that other species found unsettling. For centuries, they had kept to themselves, trading quietly, expanding slowly, and never causing enough trouble for anyone to worry about. Humans had worried anyway. Human intelligence analysts had tracked Tohari fleet movements, monitored their colonial expansion, and raised quiet warnings when patterns shifted. Those analysts were gone now. Nobody was watching when the Tohari began building colony ships on a massive scale. Nobody noticed when those ships started moving into unclaimed systems. Nobody raised an alarm when the Tohari began constructing military installations in regions that were supposed to be empty. A Loreni exploration vessel discovered the truth by accident. The ship, a small science craft with a crew of 12, entered a system on the edge of Loreni space that their charts showed as uninhabited. Instead, they found a Tohari colonization fleet. Hundreds of ships, construction platforms, military escorts. The Tohari did not let her. The crew was taken. They were assimilated into the collective, a process that involved connecting their nervous systems to the Tohari hive network. It was not painful, the Tohari claimed. It was simply emerging. The individual was not destroyed. It was improved. It became part of something larger, something more efficient, something perfect. The Lyreni did not see it that way. To them, it was the destruction of everything that made a person a person. It was murder of the self. When news reached the Lyreni homeworld, Counselor Ithara felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt rage. She called an emergency meeting with the few remaining neutral species. Representatives from 6 small civilizations gathered in a hidden station, far from the war zones and far from the Tohari's expanding reach. Ithara stood before them and proposed something desperate. She wanted to form an independent mediation body, modeled on the methods humans had used. She had studied human diplomatic techniques for years. She had notes, records, and training materials that human ambassadors had shared with her. She believed they could do it. The response was heartbreaking. The representatives listened politely. They agreed with everything she said. And then they told her the truth. They were too small, too weak, too scared. The Draenei would crush them. The Tohari would assimilate them. The Velkari would absorb them. Without human ships behind the words, diplomacy was just noise. Ithara returned to her quarters and sat in the dark for a long time. Danny Calloway's station had become something it was never designed to be. Refugees started arriving 2 years after the withdrawal. First a trickle, then a stream, then a flood. Loreni families in overcrowded transports. Marathi civilians whose crystal bodies were cracked and damaged from weapons fire. Orvani merchants who had lost everything when the Draenei seized their shipping lanes. Members of species Danny had never met and could not name, carrying children and the few belongings they had managed to save. Danny's station was built to hold maybe 200 people. Within 6 months, it held over 1,000. He was not alone in the work. A Lyreni healer named Sovi had arrived on one of the early refugee ships, and immediately began setting up a medical bay in a converted storage room. She was small even by Lyreni standards, with pale blue skin and enormous dark eyes that seemed to hold more sadness than one person should be able to carry. But her hands were steady, and her voice was calm, and she moved through the crowded corridors like someone who had been doing this her whole life. A retired Orvani engineer named Pax showed up on a freighter that was held together mostly by hope and welding tape. Pax was old, grumpy, and missing 2 of his 4 arms due to a factory accident decades ago. He took one look at the station's failing life support system, muttered something deeply insulting about human engineering, and then spent the next 3 days fixing it without sleeping. Together, the 3 of them kept the station alive. Danny handled logistics, supplies, and the endless stream of problems that came with running a refugee camp in the middle of a war zone. Sovi handled the wounded and the sick. Pax kept the machines running. But it was never enough. Danny sent messages to Grace every week. Each one was worse than the last. "Children are sleeping in cargo bays," he told her one night, his face drawn and exhausted on the comm screen. "I have got species here that I cannot even identify, and I do not know what they eat or what atmosphere they need. 3 people died yesterday because I did not have the right medication. 3 people, Grace, and I just had to stand there." Grace listened with tears running down her face. She had taken Danny's messages and compiled them into a report. She had added her own analysis, data from border intelligence, projections of how the conflicts would spread. She had built the most comprehensive case she could for why humanity needed to act. She took that case to Commander Logan Pratt, the head of Human Border Defense. Logan was a good man. He had served in the Concord peacekeeping fleet for 20 years before the withdrawal. He had friends out there, people he had served with. He read Grace's report carefully, every word, every data point. Then he closed it and looked at her. "I understand," he said. "I do. But the withdrawal was a collective decision. Every human colony and territory voted for it. The mandate is clear. We do not intervene." "People are dying," Grace said. "I know. My brother is out there." Logan was quiet for a moment. "We spent 6 centuries being the galaxy's conscience," he said. "It nearly broke us. We gave them every tool, every lesson, every chance. At some point, they have to stand on their own. And if they cannot, then that is their lesson to learn, not ours." Grace left his office, feeling like something inside her had been hollowed out. Back in the galaxy, the situation reached its worst point yet. The Valkyrie Dominion, seeing chaos everywhere and opportunity in that chaos, began quietly moving its military into the territories of smaller species. They did not call it invasion. They called it protective integration. Rissara stood before what remained of the Concord Assembly and delivered a polished speech about the Valkyrie's duty to protect vulnerable civilizations during a time of crisis. Nobody was fooled, but nobody could stop them. The Assembly fractured. The Draenei and the Valkyrie formed a loose alliance built on mutual greed. The Tohari continued their silent, methodical expansion, assimilating everything in their path. The Lyreni and a handful of smaller species banded together into a desperate defensive coalition, pooling their tiny fleets and praying it would be enough. It would not be enough. Everyone knew it. Nobody said it. The galaxy was not just falling apart, it was falling into darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, on a small station held together by willpower and welding tape, a human mechanic who did not know when to quit kept the lights on for one more day. 5 years. 5 years since the last human ship had crossed the border. 5 years since the relay beacons went silent. 5 years since the galaxy decided it did not need humanity. The galaxy was burning. The Drenai-Velkari alliance had swallowed a third of the former neutral territories. Worlds that had been free were now occupied. Species that had governed themselves for thousands of years now answered to Drenai commanders or Velkari governors. The Tohari collective controlled another quarter of the galaxy, and in their territory there were no individuals anymore. There were no names, no personal desires, no independent thoughts. There was only the hive. Refugee fleets drifted between the remaining free systems, like leaves on a dying river. Pirates and warlords had risen in the power vacuum, preying on the weak and the displaced. The Concord Assembly still technically existed, but it had not held a quorum in over a year. The great chamber on the Axis was dark and empty. The carvings on the walls gathered dust. The nameplates on the seats meant nothing anymore. Danny Calloway's station had become something remarkable. It was not a military base. It was not a political capital. It was a battered, overcrowded, barely functional space station run by a mechanic, a healer, and a two-armed engineer. But somehow, without anyone planning it, it had become the center of an informal resistance network. Refugees who passed through carried word of the station to others. Pilots who stopped for repairs spread stories about the human who had stayed behind. Resistance fighters from a dozen species used the station as a meeting point, a supply depot, and a place where they could sit down and remember what it felt like to be treated like a person. Danny hated the attention. "I am not a leader," he told Sovi one evening as they shared a meal in the tiny kitchen behind the medical bay. The food was nutrient-paced, the same thing they had eaten every day for the past 2 years. Neither of them complained anymore. "I am a mechanic. I fix engines. That is what I am good at." Sovi looked at him with her large, dark eyes. In the years they had worked together, she had come to understand humans better than most Lyreni ever did. She understood that when humans said they were not something, it usually meant they were terrified of being exactly that thing. "My people have a saying," she told him. "The one who stays when all others leave carries the weight of the world." Danny snorted. "That is a terrible saying." "I agree," Sovi said, and her skin shifted to a pale shade of blue that meant she was smiling. Grace Calloway had not been idle. For 3 years, she had worked in the shadows. She had gathered every piece of data, every intelligence report, every refugee testimony, every military analysis she could find. She had mapped the spread of the conflicts, tracked the Tohari expansion, documented the Velkari annexations, and projected how long it would take for the wars to reach human borders. The answer was not long. 2 years, maybe 3, before displaced fleets and expanding empires pushed up against human space. She did not take her case to military command this time. Commander Logan Pratt had made his position clear, and Grace understood that he was not wrong. He was following the mandate that the people had voted for. Going over his head would be pointless. Instead, she went higher. She went to the Civilian Governance Council on Earth. The council chamber was old and plain, built in a time when humanity still believed that government buildings should be humble. Grace stood before 37 council members and laid out everything she had: the data, the projections, Danny's messages, the recordings of refugee children crying in cargo bays. The images of destroyed worlds. The cold, factual analysis of what the galaxy would look like in 5 more years if nothing changed. The council was divided, as councils always were. Some argued that the galaxy's problems were the galaxy's problems. Humanity had given enough. Humanity had bled enough. Going back would only restart the cycle of dependency that had drained them for centuries. Others argued that standing by while billions suffered was not something humanity could do and still call itself human. The debate lasted 3 days. On the third day, a council member named Victor Langley asked to speak. Victor was not a dramatic man. He was 62 years old, soft-spoken, and had spent most of his career in agricultural policy. Nobody expected much from him. He stood up, adjusted his glasses, and spoke without notes. "I understand why we left," he said. "The galaxy was ungrateful. We were tired. The decision to withdraw was the right one at the time. I voted for it myself." He paused. "But I have been thinking about something my mother used to say. She said that being right and being good are not always the same thing." The chamber was very quiet. If we sit behind our borders while billions of people suffer and die in a war we might have prevented, then we are not the species we believe ourselves to be. We are not the species our children read about in history books. We are something smaller than that, something less. He took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly. I do not want to be something less. The vote was close, 20-17, but it passed. Humanity would re-engage, not as members of the Concord, not as peacekeepers under someone else's flag, on their own terms. While the council voted, something unexpected happened on Danny's station. A shuttle arrived unannounced. It was Valkyrie in design, but badly damaged, its hull scorched, and one engine barely functional. Danny almost turned it away. Valkyrie ships usually meant trouble. But the distress signal was genuine, and Danny had never turned away anyone in genuine distress. The shuttle landed in his docking bay. The hatch opened, and Risara stepped out. Danny barely recognized her. The last time he had seen the Valkyrie ambassador on a newsfeed, she had been proud, powerful, and draped in the ceremonial robes of her office. Now she was gaunt. Her scales were dull and cracked. One arm hung at an angle that suggested it had been broken and never properly set. Her yellow eyes, once sharp with arrogance, were hollow with fear. "The Dominion has fallen," she said. Her voice was hoarse. "A military faction overthrew the government. They have allied with the Tohari. The collective is assimilating our colonies. Our people are being taken." She looked at Danny, and in her eyes was something he had never expected to see from a Valkyrie. Shame. "I have nowhere else to go." Danny stood there for a long moment. He remembered her speeches. He remembered her celebrating humanity's departure. He remembered the words she had used. Meddlers. Insignificant. A correction. He looked at her standing in his docking bay, broken and afraid, and he felt all of those memories rise up inside him. And then he let them go, because holding on to them would not fix anything, and Danny Calloway was, above all else, a man who fixed things. "Come on," he said. "Let us get that arm looked at. Sovi is the best healer on the station. The food is terrible, but there is plenty of it." Risara stared at him. "Why?" she whispered. "After everything I said about your people, why would you help me?" Danny shrugged. "Because that is what we do." Sovi took one look at Risara's injuries and immediately went to work. Pax brought a blanket and a cup of something warm. The refugees in the corridor stared at the Valkyrie woman, but said nothing. On this station, everyone had a story. Everyone had lost something. Nobody was turned away. That night, while Risara slept in a corner of the medical bay, and the station hummed with the sounds of 1,000 displaced souls, Counselor Ithara detected something on the old human communication relays. The relays had been silent for 5 years, dead metal floating in empty space. But now, faintly, a signal pulsed through them. It was weak at first, barely a whisper. Then it grew, stronger, clearer, broadcasting on every frequency, in every major galactic language. Ithara sat in her command chair aboard the tiny flagship of the Lyreni Defensive Coalition and listened to the message repeat. "This is the human fleet. We are returning. To all who seek peace, hold fast. To all who wage war, we strongly suggest you reconsider." Ithara read the words on her screen. She read them again. Her skin flushed deep green. a color her species only displayed in moments of overwhelming hope. For the first time in 5 years, she smiled. The human fleet did not arrive quietly. 72 capital ships tore through fold space and emerged in the heart of what used to be the neutral corridor. The light from their arrival flared across sensor screens on every station, every outpost, and every warship within 100 light-years. Communication channels that had been filled with static and screaming for years suddenly went silent as every species in the region turned to look at what had just appeared. The flagship was called the Enduring Light. It was the largest vessel humanity had ever built, a ship designed not just for war, but for everything that came after war. It carried diplomats and doctors, engineers and translators, supplies and building materials. It was a statement. Humanity had not come back to conquer, it had come back to clean up the mess. Admiral Cara Dune stood on the bridge of the Enduring Light and studied the tactical display. She was 51 years old, tall, lean, and possessed a calm that her crew found either reassuring or terrifying, depending on the situation. She had spent the last 5 years overseeing the construction of this fleet, training its crews, and preparing for a mission she had always known was coming. Because Cara Dune understood something about humanity that the politicians had taken longer to accept. You could vote to stop caring, but caring did not listen to votes. The Tohari Collective responded first. A massive fleet, 3 times the size of the human force, moved to intercept. The Tohari had grown powerful in humanity's absence. They had assimilated dozens of species, absorbed their technology, their resources, their knowledge. Their ships were efficient, uniform, and lethal. Every vessel moved in perfect synchronization, controlled by a single hive mind that processed information faster than any individual brain could manage. Admiral Dune opened a channel to the Tohari command vessel. She spoke calmly, without emotion, without fret. "This is Admiral Cara Dune of the human fleet. I am not here to negotiate, because the time for negotiation was 3 years ago, when you began assimilating people without their consent. I am here to inform you that you have one standard cycle to begin withdrawing from all occupied territories. After that, we will remove you ourselves." The Tohari did not respond. They never did. The hive mind did not see the need for words when numbers spoke louder. Admiral Dune waited exactly 1 standard cycle, not a minute more. Then the human fleet moved. The Battle of the Corridor would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries to come. Not because of its scale, though it was enormous. Not because of its violence, though it was fierce. But because of what it revealed about the difference between efficiency and adaptability. The Tohari fought with mathematical precision. Every ship knew its role. Every formation was calculated to maximize firepower and minimize loss. It was perfect warfare, designed by a mind that could process 1,000,000 variables simultaneously. The humans fought like humans. They improvised, they adapted, they did things that made no tactical sense, until suddenly they made perfect sense. A squadron of light cruisers charged directly at the Tohari center line, drawing fire, then scattered in 12 different directions, pulling the enemy formation apart like fingers prying open a fist. Bomber wings dropped out of fold space behind the Tohari rear guard, striking supply ships and communication relays. Electronic warfare specialists deployed a new weapon, a targeted electromagnetic pulse that disrupted the Tohari hive communication network without causing lethal damage. The effect was devastating. Cut off from the hive mind, individual Tohari ships became confused. They drifted. They collided with each other. Some fired on their own allies. The Tohari had never trained for individual combat because they had never imagined a scenario in which they would be individuals. The concept was, to them, unthinkable. and that was exactly what the humans had counted on. The battle lasted 11 hours. When it was over, the Tohari fleet was broken and retreating. The human fleet had lost 9 ships. The Tohari had lost over 100. Admiral Dunn did not celebrate. She ordered her medical ships forward to rescue Tohari survivors. Some of her officers questioned the decision. These were the same beings who had forcibly assimilated thousands of people, erasing their identities, their memories, their selves. Why save them? Dunn's answer was simple. Because if we do not, then we are no different from them. And we did not come all this way to become something we are not. Word of the battle spread across the galaxy within hours. The Draenei Federation, bogged down in a war against the rogue Velkari military faction and already losing ground, immediately sued for a ceasefire. Their ambassador sent a message to the human fleet requesting talks. The message was polite in a way that Draenei communications had never been before. Smaller species, emboldened by what had happened, began to push back against their occupiers. On a dozen worlds, resistance movements that had been hiding in shadows came into the open. Lyreni patrol ships, flying alongside Orvani freighters armed with makeshift weapons, moved to reclaim their borders. Counselor Ithara led the Lyreni coalition to meet the human fleet at the edge of the corridor. When her small flagship pulled alongside the Enduring Light, she stood at her viewport and looked at the massive human vessel and wept openly. Her skin shifted through every color her species could produce, a display of emotion so intense that her crew had to look away. She sent one message to Admiral Dunn: "Welcome home." Danny Calloway watched the news feeds from his station. Around him, the corridors were filled with people cheering, crying, and holding each other. Species that had spent years living side by side in fear and exhaustion now embraced with a joy that transcended language and biology. Sophie stood beside Danny, her pale blue skin glowing with a warmth he had never seen before. "Are you happy?" she asked him. He watched a Lyreni child run laughing through the corridor, chased by an Orvani boy who was pretending to be a starship. He watched Pax, the old grumpy engineer, sitting in a corner, wiping his eyes with his one good hand, and pretending he wasn't crying. He watched Risara, the former Velkari ambassador, standing in the doorway of the medical bay, staring at the news feed with an expression that was equal parts relief and guilt. "I do not know," Danny said. "I am glad help came. I just wish it had come sooner. And I wish the galaxy had not needed us to come back. I wish they had learned." Sophie placed her hand on his arm. Her touch was cool and gentle. "Perhaps that is the lesson," she said. "Some species carry the fire. Others need to see it to remember what warmth feels like." Danny looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. The Peace Summit was held aboard the Enduring Light 1 week later. There was no music, no ceremony, no flags or banners. The conference room was plain and functional, with a long table and simple chairs. Representatives of dozens of species sat around that table, some humbled, some defiant, some simply too exhausted to be anything at all. Ambassador Kyle Whitfield had come out of retirement for this moment. He looked older than the last time anyone had seen him. His hair was gray, his shoulders were thinner, but his eyes were the same, clear, steady, and endlessly patient. He stood at the head of the table and looked at every face in the room. Risara was there, representing the Velkari refugees, her broken arm now properly healed. Counselor Ithara was there, standing tall for the first time in years, her skin a calm, steady green. The Draenei representative was there, sitting stiffly, pride wounded but alive. Even a Tohari delegate was present, a single individual who had been cut off from the hive during the battle, and was now experiencing something no Tohari had experienced in generations, being alone with its own thoughts. Kyle spoke. "We left because we were tired of being the only ones who cared enough to try," he said. His voice was quiet, but carried easily in the silent room. "We came back because we realized that caring is not something you can turn off, no matter how much it hurts." He paused and looked down at his hands on the table. "I do not know if the galaxy has learned anything from the last 5 years. And to be honest, I am not sure humanity has either. But we are here, and we are willing to try again." He looked up. "This time, we are not going to do it alone. This time, every person in this room is going to learn how to carry the fire together. Because next time we leave, there might not be a next time." The room was silent. Then slowly, Counselor Ithara began to clap. The sound was soft and lonely in the large room. Then Sovi joined from the gallery, her small hands making barely a sound. Then Pax, then the Orvani delegates, then others, one by one, like stars appearing in a dark sky. Not everyone joined. The Draenei representative sat with his arms folded. The Tohari delegate did not understand the gesture. Some simply sat in silence, unwilling or unable to let go of their pride. But enough. Enough joined. It was not a perfect ending. The wars were not over. The scars would take generations to heal. Trust would have to be built slowly, painfully, one conversation at a time. There would be setbacks and failures, and moments when the whole thing seemed ready to fall apart again. But it was a beginning. And for humans, that had always been enough. The stars, outside the viewport, looked the same as they always did. Cold, distant, and completely unaware that everything was about to change. Ambassador Kyle Whitfield stood with his hands behind his back and stared at the massive ring-shaped station growing smaller and smaller behind his ship. The station was called the Axis. It was the heart of the interstellar Concord, the great alliance of 43 spacefaring species. For 600 years, humans had walked those halls, argued in those chambers, and bled for the promises made inside them. Now, they were leaving. Lieutenant Nora Beckett walked up beside him, holding a datapad against her chest. She was young, barely 30, and she had spent her entire career believing that humanity's place was out here among the stars, fixing things, building things, keeping the peace. She did not understand the decision to leave, and she was not good at hiding it. "The formal notice has been received and logged by the Concord Registry," she said quietly. "We are officially no longer members." Kyle nodded, but said nothing for a long time. The ship hummed beneath their feet. The long road home. Someone in the naming department had a dark sense of humor. "Do you think they will be fine without us?" Nora asked. Kyle finally turned away from the viewport. His face was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the deep, heavy kind that came from carrying something for too long. "I hope so," he said. "For 600 years, we put out fires that other species started. We brokered peace between civilizations that had hated each other for longer than humans had been walking upright. We built bridges that nobody else wanted to build." He paused. The galaxy had every chance to learn how to do it on their own. I am just not sure they ever did. Nora looked down at the datapad. She wanted to argue. She wanted to say that leaving was a mistake, that the galaxy still needed them, that walking away from responsibility was not something humans did. But the truth was more complicated than that. Humanity was tired. Not defeated, not broken, just tired. Tired of being the only ones who showed up. Tired of being thanked with one hand and blamed with the other. Tired of burying their soldiers in foreign soil for species that would forget their names within a generation. The decision had not been made in anger. There had been no dramatic betrayal, no single moment of breaking. It was more like a long exhale. Human colonies had been quietly pulling inward for decades. Trade routes were rerouted. Military ships were recalled. Research programs shifted toward the unknown space beyond the galactic rim. Humanity looked outward at the galaxy it had served for centuries, and then it looked inward at itself, and it simply decided it was time to go home. Back on the Axis, the reaction was mixed, though mostly it leaned toward indifference. The Velkari Dominion, a proud and ancient reptilian empire, celebrated openly. Their ambassador, a towering scaled figure named Risara, stood before the Concord Assembly and gave a speech that was broadcast across 100 worlds. Her voice echoed through the great chamber, bouncing off walls that still bore carvings from the founding species. "Let us be honest with ourselves," Risara said, her yellow eyes sweeping across the gathered delegates. "Humans were never more than meddlers. They inserted themselves into conflicts they did not understand. They imposed their values on civilizations far older and far wiser than their own. Their departure is not a loss. It is a correction." The chamber erupted in murmurs. Some stayed silent. A few looked uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. The Tohari Collective, a hive-minded insectoid species that communicated through a shared neural network, issued a brief official statement through their single representative. The statement was clinical and cold, as everything the Tohari produced was. It said that the departure of humanity was statistically insignificant to the continued operation of the Concord. The Tohari representative sat motionless after delivering the message, its compound eyes reflecting the chamber lights like dark mirrors. Only the Lyreni reacted differently. The Lyreni were a small amphibian species, gentle and soft-spoken, with wide dark eyes and skin that shifted color with their emotions. They had been humanity's closest allies for over 400 years, not because humans were the strongest or the smartest, but because humans listened. In a galaxy full of species that talked and demanded and conquered, humans were the ones who sat down, shut up, and actually listened to what the small and the weak had to say. Counselor Ithara, the Lyreni elder diplomat, did not speak in the assembly that day. She did not trust herself to keep her composure. Instead, she returned to her quarters and composed a private message to Kyle Whitfield aboard the long road home. She typed it slowly, carefully, each word chosen with the weight it deserved. Who will speak for the small, now that the loud and kind are leaving? She sent it and sat in silence, watching the lights of the Axis reflect off the water feature in her room. The water rippled gently. Everything on the Axis was gentle. Everything was designed to feel permanent and safe. But Ithara was old, and she had seen enough of the galaxy to know that safety was never permanent. It was maintained. And the ones who had fought hardest for it were now flying away. Kyle received the message in his quarters. He read it once, then again, then a third time. He sat on the edge of his bunk and pressed his fingers against his closed eyes. He thought about responding. He thought about telling Ithara that someone else would step up, that the galaxy was full of good people and good species, that the Concord was strong enough to stand without humans holding it together. But he could not bring himself to lie. He closed the message without responding, and lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling of a ship that was taking him away from the only work that had ever mattered to him. Within 6 galactic months, every human embassy was closed. Every peacekeeping force was withdrawn. The last human trade ships crossed back into human-controlled space, and the border, marked by a network of automated relay beacons, went dark and silent. The galaxy moved on. Markets adjusted. Shipping lanes rerouted. Meetings continued on the Axis as though nothing had changed. The empty seats in the assembly hall where the human delegation used to sit were reassigned to a newly admitted species within the first year. Their nameplates were removed. Their flags were taken down. The hallways that had once echoed with human laughter, human arguments, and human footsteps grew quiet and then grew familiar in their silence. Nobody talked about the humans anymore. It was as though they had never been there at all. And in that silence, in that comfortable, careless forgetting, the first cracks began to form. Not loudly, not visibly, but deep beneath the surface, in the places where the galaxy had relied on humans without ever admitting it, things were starting to shift. Old tensions, old hatreds, old wounds that had been held closed by human hands began, slowly and quietly, to bleed again. But nobody noticed. Not yet.